Did you know that a concubine once became Empress of China? Hello and welcome to World History Encyclopedia. My name is Kelly and today's video is all about the lives of women in ancient China. This video was kindly sponsored by History Hit, a company that brings you the stories that shaped the world through their award-winning podcast network and online history channel. It's like Netflix, but for history. With over 500 documentaries, 1,000 plus podcast episodes, and 5,000 history-related travel articles, History Hit are adding new programs and podcasts each week. If this all sounds pretty great, then be sure to visit historyhit.com and use our code WORLDHISTORY to get 50% off your first 3 months. And as always, you can support us by joining our Patreon, which you can find a link for down below. In ancient China, it was widely known that it was better to be born a male than a female. To be born a female meant being subordinate to one's father, then to one's husband, and if a wife became a widow, then she would be subordinate to her sons. This is a system known as the three followings, or sancong. Often, Chinese women were physically ill-treated, they were socially segregated, and had to compete for their husband's affections against his concubines. They were both socially and politically lower in status than men, and they had to live in a male-dominated society under the weight of both religious and philosophical norms that were created by men in favor of men. Despite this, some women in their daily lives found ways around the social conventions, and some lived extraordinary lives, excelling in literature, scholarship, and even ruling the Chinese Empire. In ancient Chinese literature, sometimes female characters would state that they were a man in their previous life, but had been born a female in this one as a punishment for past deeds. And a common introduction for women in literature was the line, "Unfortunately, she was born a woman." There was also the tradition of idealizing women in literature while at the same time oppressing them in real life. The Four Beauties are 4 women whose actions dramatically affected the fate of the nation. These women are Xi Shi from the spring and autumn period, Wang Zhaojun from the Han Dynasty, Diaochan, a fictional character from the book Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and Guifei, who was both idealized and demonized. Sometimes a 5th is listed, Consort Yu, a famous concubine of Shang Yu, who sacrificed herself for her lover at the Battle of Xi Shi in 202 BCE, and sometimes Diaochan is replaced with Consort Yu. There is also the example of the legendary Chinese literary character Mulan, who could only bring honor and help her family dressed as a man, not as a woman. A male child would financially contribute to their family as adults, would continue the family name, and perform rituals like ancestor worship, whereas a woman couldn't earn money and one day would leave their family for their husbands and worship her husband's ancestors instead. This desire for boys rather than girls meant that many baby girls were abandoned after birth, and those that did survive were given names like Chastity and Pearl, or bird and flower names, with the hope that the child would live up to their name and be offered attractive marriage proposals. The 4 fields women were expected to excel in were fidelity, cautious speech, industriousness, and graceful manners, and particularly valued in ancient Chinese society was a woman's virtue. In the case of, say, a chaste widow, a woman might be given the honor of a shrine, monument, or commemorative tablet after death. Marriages in ancient China kept social and economic considerations in mind far more than they did the concept of love, and couples were arranged by both sets of parents. Girls were married usually in their late teens and men in their early 20s, and even though it was illegal, the practice of child brides did still happen occasionally. Some marriages were arranged by their parents when the couple were still young, or even babies. The wife would move to the home of her husband or her husband's parents, and on the night of their wedding, she would be carried on a red bridal chair in a great procession. Her feet couldn't touch the ground between her family home and her husband's home to ward off evil spirits, and often, upon her arrival at her new home, it would be the newlyweds' first meeting. The wedding ceremony was a chance for the groom's family to show their wealth, and the splendor of these occasions could become quite a financial burden on the groom's family. If the groom died shortly before the ceremony, sometimes the wedding still went ahead, and the woman would move into her late husband's house as a widow. The wife's family had no part in the wedding ceremony, but the newly married couple would make a formal visit to her family a few days later. So the woman was transferred from her father to her husband, and as if it wasn't enough that she was basically the property of her husband at this stage, she might have also gone through years of pain through the ancient practice of foot binding. Foot binding is when girls from around the age of 3 onwards would have their feet crushed and then bound tightly to make them smaller, in the belief that smaller feet would appeal to their future husband. A man could divorce his wife on only a few grounds: if she failed to bear a son, if she was unfaithful, if she showed a lack of filial piety to the husband's parents, if she stole, if she suffered a virulent or infectious disease, if she showed jealousy, and if she talked too much, while a woman could only ask for a divorce if the husband mistreated her family. A woman couldn't be divorced if they had no family to return to, or if they had gone through the 3-year mourning period for her husband's dead parents. Although men had more grounds to divorce their wife than vice versa, it wasn't very common, since divorce in ancient Chinese society would have had negative social repercussions for both parties. Widows were also expected not to remarry, even though many amongst the lower classes did. Since a widow didn't inherit any of the property of her dead husband, she didn't have anything to offer a new husband. Getting married and having children was the expected course for all adults, and only men who couldn't afford a wife wouldn't marry. During the Han Dynasty, women with babies were given a 3-year tax exemption, but an unmarried woman brought a special tax on her family. Having a son was far more desirable than a daughter, and so having a son was a huge help for a wife in being accepted into her husband's home. Upper-class women lived strictly controlled lives and were confined to the inner chambers of the family home, with their ability for movement incredibly limited. They did have important responsibilities in their home though, including managing the household finances and educating their children, but they were not the head of the family home. Wives of lower status men, like farmers, were expected to work the fields, especially if they cultivated rice. Often if a crop failed or they were experiencing a drought, women were forced into prostitution. They often worked in the home weaving silk and caring for the silkworms, and like men, some women were called on to perform labor service as a type of taxation in many periods of ancient China, although it didn't happen very often. Chinese men only had one wife, but they could openly enjoy the company of courtesans, and even invite concubines to live in their homes. Prostitution was an accepted part of city life, and often officials and merchants would visit houses where prostitutes worked their trade. Concubines, on the other hand, could often provide a male heir if the wife was only providing daughters, although the concubine didn't have the legal status of the wife and were technically classed as servants. There was no limit to the number of concubines a man could buy, only his own means could limit him. Often concubines came from lower classes of society and entered the households of wealthier families. But a girl from a higher social standing could be given as a concubine to an even wealthy one, or even the royal palace. One woman who started off as a concubine for the emperor but ended up seizing power herself was Xi Shi. She was first a concubine for the Tang dynasty emperors Taizong and Gaozong, and after reigning as regent for her sons Zongzong and Ruizong, she eventually took the throne for herself and proclaimed herself as emperor. Although her rule was littered with family assassinations, political intrigue, and a shock to Chinese tradition, she actually expanded the state bureaucracy and was a great patron of Buddhist art until the end of her reign. There was also Ban Zhao, who lived between 41 and circa 115 CE, who wrote commentaries on the Confucian classics, and became one of the most famous female writers and scholars in early China. Her most famous work, though, is Nujie, or Instructions for Women, which expands on the four virtues, behaviour, work, virtue, and speech, that women were expected to uphold. And although Zhao expressed the importance of a woman being subservient to her husband, she also comments on the benefits of women educating themselves. Do you know of any exceptional ancient Chinese women who lived an extraordinary life, even with the political and social boundaries built up against them? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on our new videos every Tuesday and Friday. This video was brought to you by World History Encyclopedia. For more great articles and interactive content, head to our website via the link below. If you like my shirt, you can find this design and a bunch more in our shop at worldhistory.store, or you can find a link for it under the merch tab down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you soon with another video.